kids that grew up in the valley had a strong interest in cruising. When I got to college and I actually studied a lot of anthropology, I began to realize that that was a uniquely American mating ritual involving automobiles. I came up with the idea of doing the movie. It was in the 60s. It was, the hippie culture, drugs, cruising was gone, and I really felt compelled to sort of document the whole experience of cruising and what my generation used as a way of meeting girls and what we did in our spare time. So after I finished THX, I was didn't quite know what to do. Francis had challenged me to do something warm and fuzzy.
I was very much advising that George focus on writing, and that, that he no doubt had the talent to write, and that ultimately it was all in the vision and the script, and that he could write something and make a film that would have a strong audience enjoyment as part of it. So he sat down and wrote American Graffiti.
I wanted to document the end of an era, how things change, how one of the life passages, how you go from being a student into the real world, and you leave your hometown, you leave your family, you leave everything behind, and you go off on your own, and parallel that with what was going on in the United States at that time in terms of loss of innocence, getting into the Vietnam War, the advent of British rock, and generally issues that centered around the idea of change. I talked to Bill and Gloria about the project.
And he said, why don't you come over, I want to talk to you about something. So we went over and he said, I want to do a movie about rock and roll. I'd love for you guys to write it and so forth. So we said, terrific. And I think it was almost a year later when he said, let's do it now.
And we sat down, talked about the story outline I developed in terms of the various characters and the various story elements that happened.
Which was initially just talking about people we knew in high school. We had all gone to high school at the same time, and I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, so, that was a cruising culture, too. And we thought about friends of ours and what the various stories might be. And then we started outlining, and we put a lot of cards up on a bulletin board. And I think we wrote a 15-page treatment.
And I took that treatment around to all the studios to see if I could get some money so that Bill and Gloria could write the script. Because I'd finished writing THX, and I swore I'd never write another screenplay as long as I lived. So I took it around to all the studios. Nobody wanted to do it. And I couldn't get any money to develop the screenplay. And this went on for quite a while. My first film, THX, had been entered in the Cannes Film Festival in the Director's Fortnight, which is, your first film. There's a little side festival that has to do with directors and their first films. Warner Brothers was not real happy with me for making that movie, and they weren't going to pay my way to Europe or anything, but I had some money left over just from doing THX, and I decided to blow it all on a trip to Europe. I'd been dealing with United Artists on the West Coast as sort of vice president, and I said, this isn't getting me anywhere. I'm going to go and talk to the president of the company, who was David Picker. So when I was at the Cannes Film Festival, the one thing I got to do was go up in this big fancy hotel. We were staying on the outskirts in some little pension. I went in there and he said, well, I read the story treatment. It sort of makes sense to me. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you $10,000 to write the script. I immediately called Bill and Gloria on the phone and said, I got the money. You can start today.
And he said, so when I get back, you should have the script done. And I said, well, it'll take us a little longer than that.
And they said, oh, we're in the middle of doing a cheapy horror movie.
And I said, George, I want to direct, and this is a chance for me to make the movie, so, we're really going to have to back out of this.
And I said, oh dear, what am I going to do? And so I called back here and got another friend of mine who had gone to school with, and I said, we've got this story treatment, we've got this outline, and I need a script, and I want to try to get it by the time I get back from Europe. I got back from Europe. I read this screenplay, which was very, very different than the story treatment. It was sort of Hot Rods to Hell. It was a very, very different, much more theatrical kind of piece. And I said, oh my God, what am I going to do? He got paid all the money, so I had no money left. I had no script, and I had to turn something into United Artists. So I sat down, and I started from scratch, and I wrote a new script based on the story treatment that Bill and Gloria and I worked out. And finished it in 3 weeks, turned it over to United Artists, And they hated it.
They said, we don't want to make this movie.
It's a musical montage. There's no characters. There's no story. They said, no, we don't want to do this.
So I think for a year, George went around trying to get Graffiti made.
Nobody wanted to do it. So then I came back, and I was running out of money because I'd spent most of my money on going to Europe. So I was getting pretty desperate. And I started getting job offers because of THX. They started offering me to do basically record albums. Things like Tommy and Hair, and, all kind of movies that don't have any plots. But I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do a rewrite on this script. So I did another rewrite on the script, took it around to all the studios again, and finally Universal said, well, this is an interesting project. I think we'll do it. They said, well, one thing you need is we need to connect some kind of name to this. And I said, well, it's a cast of teenagers. How in the world am I going to get a name connected? They said, well, it could be anybody. It could be, a producer or somebody. And so I went back to Francis, and I said, Francis, they want a name. And he had just finished shooting The Godfather. It was about to come out. And so the talk was really high on it. And I said, would you like to produce this for me because I need a name?
Well, I believed in American Graffiti from the moment I read it, and thought it was very funny and very warm, and I said, of course.
So we went back to Universal, and I said, well, what about Francis? Would he be a big enough name for you? And they said, oh, yeah, great, you got Francis. You got the deal. So I got the deal, and we started casting, and we started getting ready to make the movie. And I said, I read the script, and I said, this script still needs a lot of work, especially the Steve and Laurie story was very weak. So I called up Bill and Gloria. This was about 2 years later. It's taken me about 2 years to get from the first phone call, hey, do you want to do the script, to this phone call, which is, I'm about to go into production. Do you want to do a quick rewrite for me?
We had talked about this so thoroughly, and we knew the characters so well that when we went back, we were able, to pull everything together that we had wanted originally.
They came in and rewrote the script for me at the last minute and really punched up the Steve and Laurie story.
And there was no discussion, no studio, nothing. George loved it, and that was it.
That's really the story of how the whole thing got started. When I grew up, I did a lot of cruising, and I grew up working in a foreign car service. I wanted to be a race driver, and I was a mechanic through most of high school. So to me, cars were my life, and that's what I thought I was going to end up doing was being a mechanic and racing cars the rest of my life. So the cars were very central to me in the movie, and the relationship that the people had with the cars. And it sort of got into an area that I was very interested in, still am, in terms of man's relationship to machines, and also the intimate nature of people's familiarity with disc jockeys who they've never met, who is basically a fictitious fantasy character that they become very friendly with because they listen to them all the time on the radio, especially if they're cruising at night. There's this fantasy character that actually becomes a real part of your life, and that had to do with sort of technology and people's relationship to technology, and sometimes how they relate better to the disc jockey than they do to the person sitting next to them in the car. So I was taking all these themes and putting them together. I was very interested in the relationship between teenagers and rock and roll. I grew up on rock and roll, and I saw a great shift in rock and roll in the early 60s when the British invasion came, and the old innocent rock and roll came out of the blues, was kind of being distilled and moved in different directions.
I don't like that surfing shit. Rock and roll's been going downhill ever since Buddy Holly died.
So when I wrote the film, I would play the music and select a piece of music for each scene.
It was really the first film to have wall-to-wall classic rock soundtrack, something that has set a precedent is fairly common today, such that now you have a credit for somebody on films called music supervisor, and that's their responsibility, choosing the songs. Well, this position didn't exist at that time, and George really created it, and he did it himself. So as he was writing the screenplay, he had his sister's 45 RPM record player and this stack of rock and roll 45 RPM records from the late 1950s, early 1960s.
I had a big rock and roll record library from when I was in high school. I kept everything I had. So I used it. I would pick a particular song and say, okay, this is a song that sort of is this scene. And I would write the scene to that song.
And as you were writing the scene, you'd also write down what he was listening to at the time.
So there was a very, very strong relationship between the song and the scene that was written to go with that song. In a way, they're all my character except maybe for Steve, which is why the Steve and Laurie scene, I had a hard time writing them, and why ultimately Bill and Gloria had to write that. I think the character I identify with is Kurt, because he's the one that leaves town, he's the one that goes off, he's the one that has the adventure, and that's what I did. I obviously started out as Terry the Toad. I think everybody does. And so I took my early years of really pre-driving when I was 14 and 15, and that was the basis of that character, plus a lot of friends of mine that I knew. And then eventually, when I was in junior college, I was more like, John Milner, and I was more, I had a race car, and until I almost got killed in it. So that part of the relationship between racing and, always on the edge of getting killed and that sort of thing was where that character came from. But there's this other side of me, which is the anthropologist side, I'm going to get out of town and try to make something of myself. I'm going to go do something really crazy, like go to film school. That's the Kurt side.
A lot of the stuff with Rick Dreyfuss and the teacher, the English teacher when Rick is trying to figure out whether he really should leave town and so forth, those were things that happened to me. I had a friend who went off to Middlebury College and only lasted a semester and then came back.
Where'd you go again?
Middlebury, Vermont.
Right.
Yeah, got a scholarship.
Only stayed a semester?
One semester. After all that.
A lot of the things were sort of created from fables. The obvious thing when you go into a liquor store and you're trying to cover the fact that you don't have an ID, and then just odd ideas like, well, what if somebody's coming in at the same moment to rob it, and they get the liquor for you. Candy Clark's based on people we knew. There were always girls like that.
And Cindy is based on sort of with girls from that period, that era in time, and her feelings about the Ronnie Howard character. And the Ronnie Howard character is, the big man on campus, that type of high school hero, but who's kind of limited in many ways, is based on people you went to school with.
I just don't think it would work out.
I had other friends that were sort of hot dog racers that I knew, that I hung out with, and it was based on a lot of different composites of friends.
Back in some action? Yeah, I think so.
We named it after John Lewis, the character, because he was kind of a boisterous, full of himself character. Bill and Gloria were very good friends of John, so we all decided to do homage to John. But it was actually based more on racing friends that I had in Modesto than my film school friends. Well, the person you should probably talk to really is Fred Roos, because he's the one that did all the casting.
Well, in those days I was a casting director, and I had just done The Godfather with Francis Coppola.
Fred Roos is an extraordinary eye for talent and loves actors and keeps track of them. So when American Graffiti came along and there were the roles for so many wonderful young people,
And we spent weeks and weeks and weeks, months and months, seeing hundreds of actors.
Basically, I cast the movie by doing a lot of hard work. I cast it for 6 months. I saw thousands of kids.
I would do a lot of pre-interviewing of people that I didn't know, and then when George was ready to interview, we would just set up in an office. I think it was right here on the Universal Lot somewhere, and see people all day long.
I'd see everyone for about 5 minutes, talk to them for a few minutes, and then I'd make out a list of the ones that I thought had potential.
And that went on for quite a few weeks, many weeks.
It was a real eye-opener for me, beginning with the casting sessions.
I had been a casting director of Andy Griffith for a couple of years, and then the entire run of the Mayberry RFD series. So I had been around Ronnie for some years, and as I'm growing up into a teenager, he was so identified with those shows that he was not instantly sought out to be in movies, and at least my perception, he was kind of in a down period of his career, even at 18.
When I went into the audition, with George, it was just a 5-minute meeting, and I told him that I was planning to go to USC as a film student. We talked about that a little bit, and then I said, now look, I know I don't want to do damage to my hopes here, because I'd like to be considered for the movie, but I can't sing. He said, well, what difference does that make? And I said, well, my agent told me it's a musical. He said, well, it is a musical. I said, well, I can't sing. He said, it doesn't matter that you can't sing. And that was the end of the interview, this very cryptic sort of conclusion.
You're just mentally playing with yourself. Just relax and we'll talk about it at the airport.
Richard was just an actor, a young actor around town who was going on interviews, and I had interviewed him on several occasions for TV shows or other movies I was casting. I had never connected with him found the perfect part for him or got him into anything I was doing, but I continued to bring him in because I liked his work. I thought he was incredibly talented.
What I do remember is that there were readings, then there were more readings, then there were more readings, and then George brought potential groups together.
And I'd bring those kids back, I'd have them do readings from the script, and then I'd whittle it down to another group, and then I would take that group and I'd shoot video tests of that group.
It's the first time I ever saw videotape used. And so I thought, well, I must be getting kind of close. And by now I was zeroed in on the role of Steve.
And I finally did 16mm screen tests with the final group.
And Haskell Wexler shot it. And I think that was the first time that I actually auditioned with Cindy Williams.
I screen tested with Ron Howard, and I think we did the dance scene and holding scripts.
I don't care if you leave this second.
What is wrong with you? You're acting like a snotty little bitch. She wants everybody to...
What did you call me? Oh, God, come on.
I thought you didn't want to dance.
Smile or something, Steve. Everybody's watching. Don't patronize me. Do you think I care if you go away? You think I'm gonna crack up or something? Boy, are you conceited.
Quit bitching.
Paul Amat was one of the ones I thought of when I first read the script. He was a boxer, but he was also getting his feet wet as an actor and going on interviews. And I had interviewed him a few times.
And he said, I got an interview for you, and went upstairs, and there was this quiet, kind of unassuming guy sitting behind his desk. And they said, well, this is George. He's making this movie, and it's about hot rods and things, and there's a role for you in it as this main hot rodder. And I said, well, great.
Hey, how's it going?
Is this what they call copy or feel?
What? No, get up! Oh my God, don't say that! Oh, Jesus.
And I just stood there and didn't know what to say, and he was looking at me and saying, so I hear you're a boxer. I said, well, yeah, I'm a boxer, but you can act. I said, well, I think so, and okay, thank you, see you later. And that was it.
What the hell's going on here, Toad?
Terry the Toad was one of the hardest parts, and even during the screen testing period, I didn't really feel that we had Terry the Toad. We tested some people, and then my partner in my casting company then, Mike Fenton, called me up I think it was right when we were testing, so I just interviewed an actor that could be right for Terry the Toad, and he sent him over to me.
Hi. Hello. Buenas noches. You need a lift somewhere?
So I did a cold reading, stone cold. I hadn't seen the script, nothing. And I remember standing in the lobby there of the Thalberg building, and this guy that I later found out was George, walked by, and George Lucas looked at me and said, "Are you an actor person?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Huh."
You know, I really love the feel of tuck and roll upholstery.
Yeah. Well, come on in. I'll let you feel it. I mean, touch it. The upholstery.
Okay.
Jack Nicholson was an old friend of mine. I was going to New York once to see actors for some film or other. And Jack says, "Oh, when you go to New York, you should look up this girl, Candy Clark. She's a model with Ford or one of those big modeling agencies in New York." And he says, "I think she has something. She thinks she could be used in film."
I had heard that they were going to film this film, American Graffiti, and it took place in the 50s, so I thought, this time I'm going to dress up and I'm going to go in costume and they're going to see me and they're going to think I'm perfect for the part. So I get to the appointment and I meet George Lucas. He talks to me for a brief moment and then I'm dismissed. And then as I leave, I thought, I blew it, you know? I blew it. I'm the only one here dressed up like this, and I blew it. I look like I'm so desperate for a job, they'll never hire me now.
No, well, my name's Carol, Mr. Mann. What's your first name?
I remember a friend of mine asked me if I would go see his son in a little rock band at Hoot Night at the Troubadour. And so I did, and the lead singer in the band was Mackenzie.
And even though I'd spent a lot of time around the industry with, you know, my stepmother, Michelle Phillips, and my dad, Papa John from the Mamas and the Papas, I was still kind of naive and lived in the San Fernando Valley, lived with my mother, who was a very strict kind of Eastern Seaboard socialite lady who'd moved to California. And Fred Roos came up to me and he said, "How'd you like to be in a movie?" And I said, "Wow, that would be really cool, okay?" Because I was just a complete Valley girl. And my mother came up behind him and said, "She's only 12, you know." Because I looked older and I was sort of mature in a way. And I remember that we went for an audition and there were hundreds of girls there. It was like a big audition.
How old are you?
I'm too old for you.
Oh, you can't be that old.
When I first spoke to Fred Roos and then later to George Lucas about American Graffiti, I was in the middle of a very successful carpentry career.
Come on, boy, let's go. Prove it.
Fred convinced him to come out of retirement to come and do American Graffiti because he'd kind of written off the film business at that point.
He was doing carpentry he had 2 kids and he had to put food on the table, so he had learned carpentry and was earning money at that, and I gave him a lot of work in carpentry. He rebuilt a lot of things in my house and built quite a bit of furniture for me.
What are you doing, Creep?
Bo, again, as an actor, I had interviewed, I think I had even used him in some Andy Griffith or Mayberry RFD or a couple other series that I had been casting, so I knew him and knew his work. He was a working actor, young actor, and I just brought him in to George, and he won his part through testing, as did everybody else.
Well, Wolfman Jack, again, was one of those real characters. I mean, when I was cruising the streets of Modesto, Wolfman Jack was the disc jockey of choice, and he broadcast from who knows where. It really was from Mexico someplace. It was a very powerful station. We'd pick it up in Modesto, and it was a crazy radio station, and we all loved it. So I went to do the movie. I knew I wanted Wolfman Jack.
Hey, what do you want?
George knew about Wolfman Jack, but I had some relationship with him. I think Wolfman Jack had called me up once and introduced himself, or had tried to reach me for something else, and so I proposed that we get the real guy, and George was thrilled we could have him.
He was a legend. I wanted to have that be the pivotal character in the movie because he really was the kind of mythical fantasy character that I was dealing with in terms of the fantasy of radio.
Wait a minute.
Hold it there, Diane. The Wolfman telephone.
Diane.
How you doing, Diane?
All right.
That's the Wolfman.
After you're elected senior queen, have something boys at your bar.
I heard that the best acting teacher at a high school that had the best theater program of any high school was Mount Tamalpais High School in Marin County.
And our drama teacher, Dan Caldwell, said, "Oh, they're going to have a big," in those days, they referred to atmosphere as, they said, a cattle call.
But I think I called him up and just says, "Who are your good people who are in school now or recently been in school who still look like they're in high school?" And I think he sent me several people, but I think he very, very much recommended Kathleen.
And he walked me into this room
with Fred and George Lucas, Francis Coppola, and I met them all, and they were all really nice, I thought. And they asked me to come back and read for this little part. I get to this casting call and I walk in. Could have been 200 blondes sitting there, and they were beautiful. And I looked at Gino, the casting agent, and I said, I can't wait. Look at who's here, and I won't be able to afford dinner. I won't be able to pay for the parking. I can't wait to be called in as the 201st blonde. And he said, well, the director was kind of interested in your picture. I said, he was? He said, let me go in and talk to him. So he came out and he said, George Lucas would like to see you right now. I sat down. He said, can you drive? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, thank you very much. And I thought, well, I'm glad I didn't waste all that time sitting here and the money for the parking, and I wouldn't have had dinner because obviously I didn't get this. So I went home, and when I got home, the phone was ringing, and they said, you've got it.
Then I had to come back one more time for an improv test, which I'd never been asked to do in my life.
Said it!
And sat around and improvised, and George put various groups, combinations of actors together, and we improv. And so finally, a few days after that, I found out that I got the part.
I guess it was a couple months later, I got a call that said, you got the part. And I said, what part? What are you talking about? In the movie. You got the part in the movie. And I was rolling around like a puppy dog. I was so excited.
After having read the script, I decided that I wanted to play any part but the part of Laurie. And that is the part that George wanted me for. And I said, but Laurie is no fun to play. The other two girls that's where the fun is. Debbie, that's the part I want. So I at first said no. Lo and behold, I got the part. I couldn't believe it. Years later, I asked George, hey, whatever happened to that screen test we did? And he said, oh, well, that came out black. And I said, well, how did you hire me then? And he said, well, I just liked what I saw through the viewfinder. Francis Coppola called me on the phone and said, Cindy, you want to do this movie because it's really going to be something, which was the second time I heard that, and so I did.
Then next thing, I got called to come back like 2 days later and do a final screen test. And then they offered it to me. I was delighted.
And I got it with I had no intention of doing this. At that time, I was an athlete. I was a competitive gymnast.
I was hitchhiking on Santa Monica Boulevard, and this guy picked me up and he said, hi, how you doing? And he was very friendly, and I said, fine. And he said, don't you remember me? I said, no. And he said, I'm the writer, Willard. It was Willard and Hike, one of the two writers. And he said, did they call you? Did they call you? Did they tell you the good news? And I said, what good news? He said, oh, well, I better not say anything. I said, oh, you mean I got the job? He said, well, I better not say anything.
Well, the most significant thing about this picture for me was that it was the first time that I played a role that was large enough that role's importance to the overall success of the film was significant.
George actually gave me a choice of roles. He said you could play either my character or the character that Ronnie Howard played. And I chose Kurt, which I felt was a great compliment to me.
The movie was set at night. It was about a phenomenon that took place at night, and usually, although the film cost about $750,000, that was the number that we thought of as so-called personal movies. I think under $1 million was what we thought a film should cost.
The first thing that I found out was that they wanted to give me that haircut. And I was horrified. I said, I don't want to have my hair cut like that. Oh, I really didn't want to. I fought it. Can't we do something else? And George thought that would be great, Oh, and I had to wear that thing. It was so embarrassing. It was awful. Because when you washed it, it was long on the sides and short on the top. And then when you washed it, then you had this crew cut up here, but then you had this kind of long hair hanging over here. How could I walk around, during the days or on the weekends? It was horrible. Wear a hat everywhere. It was just,
It was a time when most people had longer hair than a crew cut, and I was afraid that should something else come up, some other acting job come up, I might not be able to do it because of the crew cut. So I convinced George that a white cowboy hat might do as well.
I remember the wardrobe fitting, and I remember the hair lady deciding that they had to do this thing with double ponytails, like one ponytail just below the other, to make it look like my hair was longer than it really was. And I remember being disappointed because I had to wear this big, giant, shapeless t-shirt and jeans through the whole movie, and I didn't get to wear, like, pretty dresses or anything.
Haskell would use me to get focus. You know, he'd ask me to stand in front of the camera so that he could focus on the test pattern that I was wearing. I hated that shirt. I thought it was geeky.
The movie takes place at night in a town, and we had 27 shooting days in this location. And so we made a deal with San Rafael, which is the local town I live next door to. We shot one day in San Rafael. It was a difficult day. It was our first day of shooting. Had a very short shooting schedule. The first day shooting involved camera mounts. The Rips and the crew came in early, like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We didn't shoot until 9 to put these camera mounts on the cars. At 9 o'clock I came in and they hadn't gotten the camera mounts on the cars. They said, "What's going on?" I said, "Well, we're having a little bit of trouble. We'll get it fixed out. Don't worry. It'll just be a few minutes." At 1 o'clock in the morning, we were all ready to go to lunch, the lunch break, and they still hadn't gotten the camera mounts. They said, "Don't worry, we'll have it done by after lunch." Well, here I was on the first day shooting. I've already lost a half a day shooting. So after lunch we get there, the camera mounts are ready, we start shooting on the streets of San Rafael, finish at 5 o'clock in the morning, come in the next day to go to work at 4 in the afternoon, and the first thing I get when I get in the office is, "Well, we have a problem. The city of San Rafael called and they're throwing the contract out, they don't want us here anymore, so we can't shoot in San Rafael anymore." So I jumped in the car, we drove down to Petaluma, which is about 20 minutes from here. It's a nice little town. Petaluma opened their arms to us and saved us by letting us shoot on short notice, and the whole film was actually shot in Petaluma. San Rafael did let us come back one day and shoot a montage of just cars cruising, so most of the just generic cruising shots were shot on that day.
The other issue was that George had envisioned shooting the entire film with 2 cameras and without having a director of photography, and he got 2 good cameramen and basically said, you each shoot what the actors are doing and get what you can. And the first
week we started shooting, I was shooting at very, very low light levels. I wanted to shoot this without much light, with just little tiny bits of light. And the operators were both looking, saying, we can't hold focus because the depth of field is like 6 inches. So every time the actor moves, it goes out of focus, and we can't follow it fast enough because it's just too shallow.
At those low light levels, most of the stuff was out of focus. And I, as a producer, I remember I was in a hospital at that time with some sort of back problem, and I was worried.
And so finally I gave in and said, well, okay, maybe we need to shoot this with a little bit more light. And so I asked Haskell, who had helped me get into USC.
I got a call from George, actually, and then later Francis Coppola. Would I come up to San Francisco area and shoot for him? And I said okay, but I was working during the day, and so I went up every night. Got the plane, and actually a couple times they helicoptered me in from Sausalito.
And he was actually shooting commercials during the day, and every night he'd get on an airplane, fly up here, shoot all night, get on an airplane, fly back home, and shoot commercials all day.
So I worked until the sun came up, and then I went back to LA.
And he did this for 6 weeks, 5 weeks.
Lighting big night exteriors, particularly when the film was much slower than it is now, it took a certain amount of experience, a certain amount of expertise. For this film, I was able to get recreational vehicle lights inside the car so that we could see the actors in the car. And as far as lighting the streets, mostly we just simulated street lights, or if there were indeed street lights there, we would put 1,000 watt or 2,000 watt Nook lights on the top of the place where normal street lights are to enhance the street lights and increase it. And if there were store windows and so on, we would find out what store owners would allow us to open up their stores or leave those stores at night, so we would have some light from the stores.
It was great because we went from shooting at 8 to 12 foot candles to a few hundred, which was much easier on the operators, and they were much happier about the whole situation.
George did tell me he wanted the film to look like a jukebox. Strong colors. Nowadays, a lot of films we try to desaturate and have pastel colors, but this was certainly some picture that George was correct in the visual thing that he wanted in graffiti. And the film was shot in Techniscope, which is just one step up from 16 millimeter as far as negative size. It was sort of the poor man's anamorphic.
It's widescreen, but it uses only half of the 35 millimeter frame, so the effect is all the grain and desaturation of 16 millimeter. So in a way, it has this kind of documentary 16 millimeter look, yet the widescreen scope and frame, and so it was a really inspired decision and a great way to go.
He was very imaginative. He shot, I know, those moving car scenes with double cameras, so that really when the actors in American Graffiti are in two parallel cars talking to each other, in fact, the camera was between them, two cameras sticking out of two windows, actually photographing the two sides of the conversation at the same time. And that was a innovation George came up with, just to basically get more done each night.
I shot the film very much like a documentary film. I would set the scene up, I'd talk to the actor about what was going to